So really looking forward to this. Yeah. Yeah, where are we? Yes, welcome to, if you happen to be new to Delightful Dissent, I've only done, however many of these, 71 of these before, and completely forgotten what I'm saying. I knew we were tempting fate when we talked about avoiding chaos.
I know.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing. Yeah, so welcome to the show, everyone. If you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent is an idea that really came about through my work with people taking these pioneering approaches to complex problems and thinking about things in different ways. And Jackie is absolutely one of these people. So yeah, I'm really pleased to have you on the show. And I found doing this work, there are these strange hidden barriers, of implicit beliefs or stuff that we don't really think about as much, but that underlie how we're thinking about things. And that's really what this is about, examining those things, bringing them to light, seeing how true they really are. So I hope the show gives you some specific ideas that can help you in your personal and professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge these ideas for yourself. Because I'd like this to be something that was completely kind of normal, that everyone did, that was a big part of just, what we did every day. And the show is called Delightful Dissent because, yeah, we are kind of, maybe thinking differently about things, going against the grain a little bit. But it's not just about changing other people's minds. It's about exploring and looking at different possibilities and having some fun and playing with the ideas whilst we do it. So, yeah, so it is genuinely live. So please do bear with us if there are any technical issues. It's entirely possible. And please be aware that we might be discussing difficult topics. In this show, the likely difficult topics are probably around neurodiversity and stigma, perhaps around limits of control, limits of what we can know, and maybe about trauma as well. So if any of those are an issue for you, then please know that that's a possibility. It's also a possibility that we might use strong language. So if that's an issue for you, then please also be warned that it may come about. So yeah, there aren't any perfect answers here. This is all about exploring and asking questions, and that's of yourself and of us. If you're watching live, then please do ask any questions in the comments and we'll bring them in where we can. If you're listening to or watching the recording, then we'll be sharing information about how you can get in touch with either of us, ask questions and continue the conversation at the end of the show. So, yeah, I first met, I think we first met a few years ago now, and I think what's really interesting for me is our paths have had some kind of curious parallels. We both kind of
Indeed.
discovered things and explored things that have kind of moved us in interesting directions. So I'm really really it's really lovely to see that and to kind of be following this path. And I particularly love your ability to, really explore the really kind of wide edges of possibility and also then ground that out into something, concrete and practical and manageable, which is a really nice thing to be able to have. So I'm really pleased that you could join us on the show, Jackie.
Thank
But
you.
could you tell us a little bit more about your work and you and your work, and please?
Yeah, sure. So I call myself, I would say, like a hybrid coach. So part coaching, part consultant. And I work with neurodivergent entrepreneurs. So we look at things like getting a better strategy, system, structure in place. So yeah, I have a kind of framework that I've developed that I follow and take people through, but really working to people's own neurodiversity and like what that looks like for them. Yeah, and it's a joy, it's a pleasure. I love doing it. It's something that kind of in some way accidentally came about. My first client in this formation of the business was ADHD, and the tools and the practices and the things that I developed through my own neurodiversity just really resonated and worked. So it seems to be the path that I've gone down, and I love it. It's a joy. So yeah, does that give enough?
Yeah, I just wondered really, like, what is it that brought you to wanting, this particular thing? What was, how did you, because it's not exactly a job description or an idea that people would have necessarily thought of 10 or 20 years ago or whatever. So,
Yeah.
like, what brought you towards doing this work?
Well, it's interesting because I think I've had like I speak to many other neurodivergents, I'd have a very wonky and interesting pathway in terms of career. And I think we've spoke about this often. I started my first career, I think, in music. So I was an exec assistant for a fair while, working in kind of, with other sort of leaders or heads of department, that kind of thing. I've moved around and done various things. I kind of moved from that industry, went traveling. I took some time out. I picked up a camera. I then came back to Brighton. Actually, I'm currently in Brighton. I came to Brighton to study photography. So I did a degree in photography. But I say all of this, and there's definitely more to the story, but I always kind of felt like somehow it would all come together, but I wasn't sure how. So yeah, I did a degree in photography. I did more socially engaged work. I worked with more marginalized groups. I did a lot with fostering and adoption, children's homes, that kind of thing. I'm trying to do the skip to the end version because it feels like it's so sort of wonky. I retrained doing restorative justice, where you bring the harm and harmer together, or perpetrator and victim of a crime together. I retrained doing some mentoring of female ex-offenders coming out of prison. I did some work in counselling, so I did half a degree, and that's a whole other story. I didn't finish that. Ran a mental health program, did some program management. So I mean, like, my career is wonky as hell. So a long-winded way to answer that question is, I kind of felt like at some point all of this stuff would come together and it would make sense. And I finally feel like now at this point, it all kind of comes together and makes sense. So a lot of what I do with people, I draw on loads of that experience. So it might be something from program management, like working with Agile, or it might be something from, counseling principles, not that it's therapeutic work, or, it could be something from my background as an exec assistant, so I kind of draw on those things. So in terms of why, I think if I look back to like my early career in terms of working with music, I just loved being around creation. I loved being around people that created, and I didn't feel that I was that person at the time. I never felt like I was a creative. So the way into it was to kind of be in the background. So if I think back to like my sort of earlier career, I loved being around like when people were making music videos, or like the photography, or like being on the road and mapping out like, the tour itineraries and stuff. Or being in the studio when people are coming up with ideas of what a song's going to be, I loved that energy. And I see that kind of energy in it's very parallel to me in terms of the creative energy and entrepreneurship. So I think I thrive in those spaces. I love being around it. It gives me energy. So yeah, that was a long-winded
Yeah, no, that's
answer
lovely.
to that.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that feeling of not experiencing oneself as kind of creative in quite the same way as other people seem to be. I've kind of come to understand myself as more of a kind of synthesist more than or a weaver rather than a creative in the way that a lot of people talk about it. So yeah, it is its own form of creativity though, and I think I really like that you mentioned that entrepreneurship is creative, and I really think the idea that we can be creative in whatever domain we operate in, and that there are forms of creativity in those domains, I think is a really really lovely idea and an important idea that there's ways to do it in pretty much anything, and I think we often downplay the value and interest in in the non-conventionally kind of artsy
Yes.
creativity.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's fab. And have you before we actually get really into it, though I'm tempted already, do you have a quote that you'd like to share that
Oh
that
yeah.
yeah
Okay, let me
that
find it.
resonates for you? Yeah.
Okay, so it's a two-line, and it's I think if I can say his name correctly, Leo Babetto, and we can put the spelling in. Here's the thing: the edge of uncertainty and chaos is where we learn, grow, create, lead, make incredible art and new inventions. The edge of uncertainty is where we explore, go on adventures, get curious, and reinvent ourselves.
Yeah. What is it that really, what resonated for you in that quote that you wanted to, what made you want to share that one in particular?
I think because, and part of the thing around this topic for me is having an interesting relationship with chaos and order. You know, like I have always been very ordered a lot of my life, and if you ask a lot of my friends, they'll tell you that I'm the most ordered. You know, I'm the one that comes with a schedule and an itinerary, and you know, that kind of thing. But I think until I really understood I was diagnosed dyslexic, and I'm currently on a route to getting a diagnosis around ADHD. Thanks partly to you. Thank you. Um, you know, this, I think I am quite inherently chaotic. And I just needed systems and ways to work when I was young, and I didn't understand what was going on, to kind of help me thrive and live in those spaces. Because I if I didn't write things down, I didn't remember. If I didn't find ways to plan and map things out and have things color coordinate and do things this way, I couldn't operate. I'd kind of fall apart. So I don't know. So there's this tension for me with, like, that's how I now operate, but there's something that I feel like I sometimes miss when I'm too ordered, you know. And the chaos for me is really connected to creativity. So sometimes I don't allow that. So this edge of uncertainty and, you know, in some ways like creativity and chaos, it's an interesting thing for me to explore and look at. So part of the reason for this conversation was also like, I'm interested to see what comes out, because I don't know.
No, it's absolutely, it's funny. I really resonate with that. I think people have often said, you know, told me I'm really organized, partly because I externalize a lot of my organization. And if I didn't have it, it would be, you know, it just, stuff wouldn't happen. If yeah, it's, for me, it's like, if it isn't in the calendar, it isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
It's basically as simple as that. And so actually, so that I think, you know, there's something around this relationship between, you know, uncertainty, how we work with it, also how we make space for it, how we bring in an appropriate amount of it, that I think is a really, really helpful one. And maybe it would be helpful just to, you know, to, if the assumption is the thing we're going to be talking to is the idea that we should avoid chaos. So maybe it would be helpful just to think about, what's that relationship between chaos and uncertainty? Because I think there's that, you know, I have my own ideas about that, but I think it would be helpful to explore that a little bit.
So just can you reframe that? Say that again.
Yeah, so you know, we've got, you know, that I think that quote really spoke to, use the phrase uncertainty a lot, and you know,
Mm.
this idea of uncertainty. But how does that idea relate to chaos as a concept? How does uncertainty join up for you?
I think on a sort of personal level, and I mean, maybe that's the only place I guess I can like come from. To take it back a little, like my family fostered for a long time, from when I was about 11, and so things in the household were a little chaotic. Because we'd had kids come and go, we fostered very young babies. So I think the youngest we had was 6 hours old. You know, so we'd have kids come and go, and sometimes they'd be there for a period of time, sometimes a long time, and then they'd leave. So there was always this sense of uncertainty all the time. And so for me, what developed is a sense of control. Like I want to feel like I can control things, you know. I want to be in control, because it was often not, you know, it was situations quite often beyond our control. So I think if I think about that, like the concept of that kind of, I guess, started quite early, and the uncertainty that comes. So sometimes for me, when it is uncertain, you know, I feel like I'm kind of out of control. And it's a kind of balance now these days. And I guess the relationship between the two, the chaos and order was, or uncertainty and order. I had one of my first clients in this iteration of the business, because there was a previous iteration. We talked a lot about a lot around chaos and order, and he sort of prodded me in ways that was helpful, because he's like, I think there's more to this for you. There's more to you in some ways avoiding the chaos and not wanting to go down that route. So sometimes it's like I don't want it to be too chaotic, but you need some of it in order for creation to kind of come back around. So yeah, there's something around the uncertainty that I'm cautious of and I don't want to happen. But as I kind of get older and as I get into that, I'm like, yeah, we can't control anything. Nothing is ever in our control. It's an illusion of control anyway. So then where does it leave you, you know?
Yeah. And I think for me, there's something really interesting in this. You know, what uncertainty is such an interesting word for me, because it feels like, I think we talk about it as this kind of threshold, like there's certainty and uncertainty, but it feels like that's not really the binary we're talking about. What we're talking about is like certainty and the completely unknown is actually the two, is the thing. And uncertainty lies kind of in the space between those things. And so I think there's something really interesting for me in that, and how we approach like the stuff we partially know, the stuff we can have an idea of, the stuff we can, you know, and for me, the chaos element of that is chaos really does speak to the completely unpredictable, completely unknowable, but that there's stuff that sits between that and the completely certain and controlled and organized.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, yeah, it's such an interesting area, and for me it's a really important part of my work and how we engage with it. I don't think we're often given the skills necessary to engage with this stuff. Actually, I think how we engage with uncertainty, how we use it positively, is particularly when we're thinking about work, is not something that we really think about or use or talk about, or a set of skills we often seek to develop. So I think it's a really helpful one. But you know, if we think about this specific assumption, avoid chaos, what is it in that you know really lands for you? How does it show up for you? Maybe how do you experience that as a kind of demand, or as a, you know, an imperative that people are like, you know, don't be chaotic or avoid the chaos?
Well, it's interesting because it kind of comes out in my work, and you know, a lot of the stuff that I do with people is often people show up and, you know, overwhelmed, chaotic, stressed. You know, there's a lot going on, and they actually in some ways seeking some way to find order within that. And I think what's interesting, I had one client just say, like, I need enough order that it's good, but if you give me too much, it's not helpful. So it was this balance between the two of being able to like have enough of an order that helps somebody get through something. So, you know, if you're creating and you've got all these ideas and a lot of this stuff, but you're not getting anything out the door, you're not shipping anything, nothing's getting complete. There's just, you know, doesn't make a great deal of business sense, but it's also very frustrating, you know. So yeah, I think it's interesting in that sense of like this, I don't know, this dynamic between the two. We need I hate the word balance. I've always hated the word balance because it's something that I could never strive to. But there's something about that of the way in which I tend to work with people is finding out how their particular neurodiversity, how that shows up, and then what can we do and how can we trial that? What can we do to find a certain amount of order? And finding out that sometimes we try things. I mean, I don't know if this resonates with you, but I'll have some system or some way that'll work for me. And then one day I'll just stop doing it. And then it'll take me a little while and I'll go, oh, I was doing that and it really worked. And then somehow I just stop doing it and I have to come back and get back onto it again, Yeah, so I don't know. What was the question again?
I don't know, but that went somewhere interesting. So I think that idea of, for me, it's a lot of what works in context.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the really big things is, is this idea of, okay, what's the idea? What's the way that makes sense for this particular idea in this particular situation to get out there? What's the structure around that? Rather than, I think for me, it almost feels like is that we should almost pre-decide, because it's ordered, like it's it's like this is the plan, and therefore we have to make sure that anything that doesn't conform to that plan is a problem, versus saying, well, is this a good thing? Is this something I can use? Was the plan wrong rather than the world? Rather than, is the universe wrong or is my plan wrong? Which is often feels like it's actually, like trying to impose that order on things can spend a lot, we can spend a lot of time trying to impose order out of fear of chaos, I think, which isn't necessarily time or energy well spent. So yeah, I really resonate with that particular aspect of it that you mentioned.
And just to follow on that, I think there is this, I mean, I know that I have it for me, and partly what I touched on before is a fear of chaos, right? But I think you also find that deeply entrenched in corporate organizations, like this fear of chaos. So we put a whole bunch of systems and plans and things in place, but it never often gives room for things to shift or change. And it's like, no, this is the plan, or this is how we do things, and this is like, you got to tick this box and do this way. And I think, as a slight tangent, I got diagnosed chronic fatigue quite a few years ago. And it meant that I was in and out of work, and in and out of, I guess, like a corporate organization, And I was at an acupuncturist appointment. He said, oh, what do you do again? I said, oh, I work in an office, just to kind of give him some context. Like, I didn't go into explain, the hows and whys. And he said, oh, I've never been able to do that. It doesn't suit me. And I just had this profound moment of like, oh, it doesn't suit me. Like my body is literally, not working. I'm not operating well in these spaces, from anything from like the light, the sound, the politics, that like how it's structured, things around those plans and like needing to keep things in, like it just doesn't suit me. And it was a really profound moment of like, oh, I like need to design my life differently. I need to do things differently. This just doesn't, my body is giving in. At like, at that point I was, I don't know, in my late 30s, and it's like, yeah, so this kind of like thinking back to those kind of spaces and just recognizing that there is a lot of fear of chaos, and like we put systems, and you, in some ways you have to work in that way, but then there isn't these checkpoints or these ways of going, is this just like logical? Should we actually just be doing this? Or is this just like actually really stupid? And I remember sitting at one point, in a meeting and counting up how many people were there and thinking, this meeting itself is actually costing us, I don't know, I don't want to say, but a crazy amount of money. And I was like, is it really worth it? And I just love that way of like rethinking how we operate in spaces and rethinking, well, what does it look like? And is sometimes the answer to some of these things really simple? Like, we don't need to completely reinvent it, or like, the ideas that we can have that aren't, like, it doesn't have to fit in this box or do in this way. But I think that tends to be why I navigate more now to working with entrepreneurs and working with people who think a little differently, and the old cliche of slightly outside the box and that kind of thinking, because I recognize that I don't thrive very, very well in those spaces. It took me a while to recognize that I thrive better in spaces and people in deep connection, and organizations often don't really allow for that, those deep connections. Like, the conversations we've had over time, we've had some very interesting conversations about, all sorts of topics. I don't know that that space would have been there in more corporate spaces to have that, and that's what's important to me these days, those deep connections and those relationship building and interesting conversations and interesting topics. That's way more exciting to me. Anyway, that was a little tangent, but yeah, I just picked up on your fear of chaos and was thinking around, how that operates in bigger organizations.
You made me think there's, one of the things that's really interesting in this for me is thinking about different people's skills and different people's preferences as well, and therefore different ways of approaching something. And the one person's way of approaching something might not be the same as another person's, and it might actually make sense for one person to work something out in the abstract and for a different person to try it out instead with a different set of skills. And I think there are a whole class of things where actually we collectively we'd be a lot better if we just tried it out. Like, so I've been in so many, you mentioned those meetings where I literally sat and worked out that we were costing ourselves more trying to decide this than it would be to actually just do it.
Yeah.
And so that just doesn't make sense for me. But there's something about that avoidance of an unexpected result of like, we needed to be sure before we could act, versus being like, okay, we can be uncertain, we can explore, we can say we hope this is going to happen, we think this is going to happen, but we don't know. So we can try it out and see. Versus this idea of like 100%, okay, this is definitely going to happen, and that being both what we're evaluated on and what we're aiming for. Because I think this is the other thing, is like, it's there are a lot of places where it's really unacceptable to express uncertainty. Where you're like, oh well, I don't know, I can't know, we shouldn't, and so people end up making these ridiculous statements that just clearly aren't supportable, and then just doubling, end up in these weird arguments that are like, well, we can't know. And so I think there's a huge amount there, that avoidance of just a small amount of chaos, I think, is actually one of the big things for me. Is one of the difficulties is we introduce more when we don't explore that uncertainty. And for me personally, I think a bit like you, I have a huge amount of curiosity. It's a big drive for me. It's a big intrinsic reward. Like, it's a big intrinsic motivator, I should say. And the fact that I wasn't often allowed to explore really it made me miserable. It didn't meet a reward. Like, that's a lot of the reason I do stuff. It's to find out what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so if I couldn't do that, it took the fun out of it for me, aside from anything else. So I really resonate with this idea of like, if we avoid chaos, we can become we can become very closed off from possibility. It becomes very boring, very predictable, and also I feel quite brittle, I think the other big reason, particularly at an organizational level, to explore the edges of stuff is, well, we can't be certain about everything. And if we can bring a bit of it in, we can test whether or not this stuff is really true anymore, or how true it is. And you mentioned also, doing stuff just because because we did
Mm,
it before and then something happened. And how sure are we that those two things really relate? I
yeah.
think this is the other thing about chaos, is like there is a bit of unpredictability in the world. Did these two things just happen at the same time? Is the relationship that I did this, then this happened, and there was direct cause between the
Mm,
two? Or is it this we did them at the same time and this thing was going on independently, or there's something else between them, or there's all of this stuff. And we can't, if we can't play with the edges of it, we can't unpick that. And so we never
mm,
know. And I feel like there's something really kind of, yeah, really limiting actually in the attempt to fully avoid the
yeah.
uncertainty and the chaos.
Yeah. And I think I can speak to my own experience. What's interesting for me is, I did a degree in photography. I'm still absolutely certain that I'm not creative. I think somehow they gave me a 2-1 just to please me. I think, nah, they didn't. They probably just, I like them. They probably just gave, I don't know why. I have this like idea in my head that I'm not creative. And in a sense, the ideas in my head are like better than what I just think they're not going to be as good as what they're going to come out to be. So on this sort of very creative side, I have prevented myself doing a lot because I don't believe it's going to be good enough, or I don't believe that it's going to be. And what the journey that I've had in terms of entrepreneurship and in terms of, particularly this business, it's really got me stepping out of my comfort zone in the sense of like shipping and making work and doing things and creating. So I've been like writing on LinkedIn now for like, I don't know, a year and a half. It came through a recommendation through a friend. She sat me down and she's like, you've got things you can talk about, because I just didn't think I did. I think the things that I do everyone can do. They're just like, no, that's not true. So it's almost like I have this like creative part of me, this like who's a maker and like a storyteller. And I was always interested in storytelling from the photography, not for photography's sake, but more the storytelling element. And that part of me has been like in some ways shut down for a long time because
Hmm.
I was to live in those uncertain spaces and not be able to create in the way that I could dream up in my head. Just it really stopped me. But I think this journey through kind of, you know, entrepreneurship and working with other entrepreneurs and innovators and dreamers and big thinkers, it's completely opened up my eyes. And then just creating on a day-to-day level of like every day on LinkedIn, and then like making products and making work and services and like getting it out the door has been something about that. It's like, well, we just try. We just make stuff and we go test and we see if it works. And those very agile principles of like, okay, what can I do on a smaller level? What can I ship in this sort of 2-week period, and kind of get things out the door and get things moving? Because it's in the moving, it's in the creating that you find you've gone to that edge and thought, oh, well, that actually doesn't work. But you know what? This idea has come about. And you start to follow all these other pathways that's like, wow, I didn't know that was there. So I don't know, there's something around that kind of curiosity and I love that you said about in some ways we're really fearful of saying I don't know. It's been one of the best things for me to say I don't know. I don't know how to do that. And isn't that exciting? Like I'd just go find someone and get them to help me, or I ask someone how to do it, or I ask someone else to do it. It's just, it used to be the thing in those other spaces where it would be hiding behind that, in very corporate spaces. I don't know and don't tell anyone. I don't know how to do that. So let's hide behind that. Whereas now it's much more of a, oh yeah, I don't know. So let me go and ask these people
Let's
that
find
I've
out.
connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's funny. We've got a really nice comment from Shane Finlay here, who said, leaders that don't listen are soon surrounded by people that have nothing to say. Often they don't want to
Mm,
listen to chaos. And I feel like, there's a really big link there, partly between what we're talking about and that idea of, almost like being able to engage with this stuff as a leadership competence,
mm,
and how, because we don't train it very much, it's often not present. Um, and also our own internalized relationship with our own ability to do this.
mm,
And for me, I think of, I tend to, a lot of this funny intersection between formal, kind of more formal organized systems and kind of conventional creativity, I associate in myself with the weird paradox of autism and ADHD at the same time.
mm,
Um, and and so it's like, okay, I can do the formal and details and whatever, and I can do the context, and often the challenge is making the two coherent, making them line up. But I, like you, I hadn't, I like the thought that just the way I see things, the connections I make were inherently creative, felt really, I've never, that's only a really recent thing for me, partly because it wasn't welcome very often, partly because I
mm,
associated it with a lot of effort, whereas I just see the links. I just say,
mm,
some of it is just saying this out loud, um, and it doesn't feel effortful in the same way some of the other stuff does. So
mm.
I really feel like there's something interesting for me in that around my own relationship with, yeah, what it means to think differently and make connections, and that for a lot of my experiences, for a lot of unconventional thinkers, however that arises, is the effort isn't in having the thought, the effort is in, like, how do I package this up in a way that other people are going to get? How do I find the
Yes.
words that are going to land? How do I draw that, how do I represent this? How do I create an artifact out of this? Rather than having the thought. But because of that, I realized that, I think, for me, I hadn't actually valued the thought itself.
Mm, mm. It's so interesting. I see a lot of people come my way. I see probably a lot more ADHD. And, you know, I am totally inspired in the sense of like the ideas, the level of output, like the level of thinking and the creativity and the dreaming up things that I am like in awe, because I'm like, how did you think of that? How did you connect those dots? Like also that level of output, like what I see often is people with ADHD, will probably, if you put it in context, it would do something in a day that it would take other people like 5 days to do. And it's like this level of output, as well as like, though it's not the lack of ideas, but often the execution or the being able to get them out of the door, or the kind of follow through with that. And the way I think about it is like the systems behind that, the structure behind that. But as we spoke about, you know, there needs to be some constraints, but not too much, because otherwise it's a rebelling against that. I've had conversations with people over time where it's like, I can't, that's just too structured for me. So it's almost like you need to sort of step back a little bit and introduce a little bit of order and a little bit, and I think we've spoke about this in the sense of like needing some constraints around, the output or the creativity in order to support that. And I think when I often speak to inherently creative people, the idea of putting order into it feels like it's going to be like, you're going to ruin my creativity. It's like, it's going to be gone. But that's not my experience. I think some level of constraint or order actually supports the process rather than, negates it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you make me think, because one of the ways I think about this is the kind of intrinsic creative side is often what's not welcome, particularly when we're neurodivergent and we learn it's kind of
Mm,
unacceptable and not allowed and it'll get us into trouble. And and that so and that there is the kind of organized, predictable side that is allowed, and that we can kind of keep them completely separate. And
mm,
so we tend to hide the more creative, in inverted commas, chaotic side,
mm,
the stuff that engages with that. But and I'd always kind of thought of it as a really as something that leads us to just hide that. But actually, you're making, the way you put it makes me think, well, it almost has another side as well. It's because it's intrinsically rewarding and we do want to do it. We also associate the kind of order and organizedness with not being able to do that, with the end of that, with the death of that, which is a really interesting, which is I hadn't looked at it from the other angle before. So yeah, thank you. I think it goes both ways actually. And yeah, that's really helpful in understanding my own experience of this and my own resistance to kind of some form of order and structure. And I think the other side of this for me is also that different structure supports different things and different people need different structure. And we've got another great comment actually here from Stephen Howe, who says, great leaders also put others first and seek to create a stable environment so people can flourish and be their best. And I think that touches on, for me, that it can be different. We want to be supported, but one person's support is another person's barrier. And actually how we land with that is 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 a really interesting thing, and also how we develop this, because this is another area of uncertainty actually, and how we're developing the structure and support that we need and that we can extend to other people as well.
Yeah.
And just to
Yeah.
give a concrete example of this, actually this show, the way I do this show is not how, if you look up how to record a podcast, you will not find this method anywhere, anything like it. I just came to this because it suited my needs and it suited what I can do and what I can't do. And that relationship, where are we strong? Where do we enjoy doing stuff? And where are we relatively weak? Where do we want to avoid? Might mean doing things in a completely different way to the way that is the standard official
Yeah.
way of doing things. But we can still get to the same outcomes. We can still produce something that's valuable and interesting. And in some ways, I think the other side of it is also, for me, a big part of the letting go of the camouflage of actually being more obviously myself, is it has the possibility of attracting people in a
Yes.
more profound way as well. You can kind of find your people on a more qualitative level. And I think that's the other side of, the if we have an affinity for the slightly chaotic, for the creative, for the uncertain, that's actually going to show up in us.
Yes.
Other people can kind of read it. And if that's a source of fear for people, particularly people in authority, we might have learnt to hide that. And for me, understanding it's not my fear of this. I thought I was, it's like I love this stuff. This is actually the space where I'm happiest. Just like you said, it gives me energy. But other people have taught me, I've been taught that it wasn't acceptable, or it wasn't okay, or it was too much and it was too far, or all of these things. And that my own resistance to my own inner thing is other people's, not my own actual preference and joy.
And it's so true. And I think it brings back, like, coming back to, in some ways, understanding ourselves, like that journey of understanding and self-awareness, and what does that mean, and how do I want to show up in spaces with people? What does that look like? Can I be authentically me? And without, we talk a lot in that kind of neurodiverse space about, I'm too much or I'm too this, and just, being in those spaces where I'm not too much and it isn't, all of that. Like, can I show up completely authentically me, the one who does like the checklist and and all those, the ways that I show up, can I be that authentically? And I remember actually in one of my last roles that I emailed the team. I was in a new team and I said, look, I'm dyslexic. this is kind of what it is, because people often don't understand it. And this is how we can work better together. And so I just outline some things of can we have an agenda if we're gonna have a meeting? Can we have if you want me to read stuff, can we have it a couple of days before? Can we if don't bother with niceties on emails, just say what you need, none of this 10 things before you get to it, all this kind of stuff. And I remember that the head of communications at the time just said, well, this would just be great for everyone. And I'm like, yeah, I know. But there's this, in some ways, this fear of, if you are thinking differently, if you are operating differently, if you are someone who shows up with, diversity, that it's suddenly gonna, we got to do all these things. And it's most of the time it's really helpful in whatever spaces you are, that those things happen and operate anyway. Showing up with an agenda is just come on, people, or give me some time to digest something. And I think being open in those spaces to, and another thing that springs to mind is I remember being in a workshop and doodling, and specifically being told off for doodling. And I was like, you don't understand. I'm really present when I'm sketching, because now it helps me stay present to listen to what's going on. If you're telling me, firstly, they were telling me to stop anyway, which I just thought was weird. And then if you're telling me to stop, I'm just not here. My brain won't connect and be in this room. So it's on the outside, sometimes things that look like behaviors that are I'm not present, I'm not showing up, it's completely the opposite. What I'm doing to allow myself to show up and be present here doesn't look like the same for you, or the same for other people. So I think it's just being more open and more, I don't know. It's can we be more open and show up more authentically and be less judgy of how people show up,
Oh, yes, definitely. It amazed me think there was something that kind of flashed into my mind a while back, and I think it really makes me want to revisit is I think there's an assumption that chaos and disorder are the same thing.
Mm.
That the uncertainty, the different approaches are disordered. And actually, disorder is the wrong order. It's not chaos.
Mm.
And I think, and it's not even uncertainty. And so I think, that those things are very often conflated anyway. And this idea that we could do something in a different way because we have different strengths, preferences, ways of processing, and that if it's different to the way that one person expects, the person in charge expects, or it's different to the way that most people do it, that it is necessarily disordered.
Mm.
That feels like a really, and I think partly my relationship with uncertainty and chaos is that for some people it feels like there's an assumption that to seek it out, to engage with it, is itself disordered. Is that
Mm.
one should do everything to avoid chaos, and to do anything else is a disorder.
Yeah.
Versus actually, in the right circumstances, some engagement with it is valuable. But it's like you said, it's a question of making the circumstances right. What's the context where this is useful? And rather than saying, well, then if that's not right, then if it's not helpful now, then I need to change, actually it's like, well, where can this be applied? Where is
Yeah.
this helpful? Rather than assuming that just because it's not the conventional approach, it's problematic. It's de facto problematic.
Yeah. I mean, I think that takes me, there's a few areas that sort of takes me to, and I'm sure, I think we've spoke about this, but that, the very famous Ken Robinson TED Talk, schools kill creativity, and thinking back to that of if my way of operating in the world and thinking and doing things had been differently considered, as a young, I wonder what the pathway would have been, because I really believe that wasn't nurtured in me, that element of that within me, and like how different would that have been? And the same in the workplace. If we're not nurturing all those parts of somebody, and allowing them spaces to live and work and breathe in that way, like, we're not getting the best out of people. We're not, on a human level, but on a business level. And I think, for me, as I go down this pathway, it's like business is absolutely nothing without people. And if we're not nurturing our people in all their differences and everything that they show up, like, what are we doing? Like, I don't know. It's an interesting one, because I seem to have a few more conversations with founders and these things lately, and it's like, yeah, people are really just, when you get to those people who are interested in I don't know, looking at companies and spending money, and it's like they're just interested in the people, good people doing good work, and I don't know, sometimes at a corporate level it feels like you're not supported or nurtured in that way, and like it sort of breaks my heart in a way to think about the little me at school not being nurtured, and the me in those bigger workspaces going, I had so much more to give that nobody ever saw. I had so much more that I was able to, and I see that with clients, and I see that in that space, as that we operate in that kind of neurodiversity space, that yeah, and it's like there's so much more in here. Yeah, we're not really often allowed to be very truly authentic and show up in all those what I call weird and wonky ways, and the misfit and the not quite fitting in. But I think as time's gone on, I fit more in. The less I fit in, the more I fit into certain spaces, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That there's a specialization thing, a niche thing for me. That's
Yeah.
like, and actually a lot of that is related to value and rarity value. It's like the more it becomes being really like doing doing a thing really well. Though when I say doing a thing, accepting that the way I work is that it crosses multiple categories because the categories are all different for me. But that actually, there's a big part of that that and I think, for me, if we to kind of this idea of if we're led to uncertainty and chaos, if we have strengths in this space, as a lot of people, particularly with ADHD traits, do. Um, People with ADHD are usually really good in a crisis too, partly for similar reasons. It's when the normal rules don't apply, right? It's like like being able to do well in those spaces is its own skill set, but it's one that might not have been developed. And so I think giving ourselves the chance to play with this and explore this, figure out what supports us in this, in being really good at this. And from the other side, I think if we have a leadership role, a management role, we and to think about organizations, there's a huge missed opportunity here for a
Huge.
bunch of really valuable skills
Huge.
that we're just passing up, which
Yeah.
is just bad business, really. You've
Yeah.
got all of this really exceptional talent. And I think for me, there's I'd like to see us move to a point at which these things are part of school and are developed during school. We're allowed to be creative in our domain, in whatever domain. But where that isn't the case, we can do it in work. We can do it through our own work. We can create workplaces where it's more likely and more possible. And we can kind of invite others to do it too. And hopefully, address that. It doesn't have to happen it happens when it happens. And that's, and yes, it would be in many ways better if it happened earlier, but if it hasn't, then, well, we can do it now, and we can give ourselves that chance now instead.
I mean, yeah, there's a part of me that has a grander plan at some point to I'd love to do like a charity or something where we seed funded like neurodivergent teenagers, to just go, oh, just go try this idea, like go do things differently than what, in that very sometimes feels very boxy way of like coming out of school and doing these pathways. Like, what if we just gave you some money to go and do that thing that you really love doing, or that thing you're excited about, and seeing that there's another pathway, and I think some of that is about those conversations around there's another way to do life, and there's another way to do business, and there's another way to operate in this world. We don't have to go to all the fake rules. You don't have to live in that way. Who said? Someone just made it up somewhere that you got to do this. You got to go to the office and be in the office in these spaces and this times and have this kind of life and this house and like, who said? Let's just do it differently. And I think that's what I like about being around these spaces, is just like people thinking and operating in different ways to say, well, what if we just didn't do it like that anymore? Like, what if we just stopped doing that? What if we just changed it and did something else entirely? That's where the energy's at. That's where it's exciting for me, because it's like suddenly anything's possible. Anything's possible, and that's the places that I'd rather be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really, really lovely place to end. And I think, for me, granting ourselves that as well, ourselves and other people, and that's two sides of the same coin anyway, very often. If we create a space for ourselves, we kind of create a space for other people. Feels like a really lovely way to end this, to start to wrap this up. And yeah, and I think it's such a valuable thing and such a healing thing when a preference or a predisposition towards chaos and the chaotic side of things has been something that we can often feel very shameful, and to reconnect with it in a positive way is a lovely part of that whole giving ourselves a bit more space thing, I think. So
Yes.
if people want to get in touch with you, find out a bit more about what you do, we've got your website and your LinkedIn in the show notes.
Yeah.
And did you, I think you're also planning is it a mastermind for neurodivergent entrepreneurs. Do you want to say
Yes.
anything about that?
I'll say, yeah, just briefly. I'll probably be launching in probably July. So if anyone wants to find out a bit more information, but basically bringing neurodivergent entrepreneurs together. So we do a sort of bi-weekly call, keep each other accountable, have a lot of fun along the way. Yeah, it's gonna be good fun and interesting. So I'm happy to share any information if anyone wants to find anything out. So yeah.
Fab. And can people find out more about that through the website,
Not
or get
yet
in touch
because
with
of
you on LinkedIn? Okay.
that's
So
probably
connect with
better.
you on LinkedIn if you want to find out more about that. Is that the,
Yeah.
yep, fab.
And I would
Okay.
just say I'm really open to calls. I keep my diary open for networking calls, and I'm always interested in just talking to people, because I fundamentally like people and it's interesting. So if anyone wants to reach out and have an online coffee, I'm game. So yeah, let me know.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. And I like to share sometimes, I think, a couple of resources if people have kind of landed on stuff, particularly from a management perspective. If you're in this area, there's a book I really like called Embracing Complexity by Bolton, Allen and Bowman, that might be worth exploring if you're a manager or a leader and you're thinking, okay, how do I implement some of the stuff that we've spoken about? And I think more from a psychological perspective and maybe a personal perspective, it is quite psychology based. So if that isn't your thing, then it won't work for you, this book. But Coming to Our Senses by Vicky McCabe is also a really, really good book about kind of orienting back in the creativity and that side of lived experience and its importance in our expert lives and our professional lives as well. So I just wanted to share those two as possible things. So yeah, thank you, Jackie, so much for joining
Thank
us. I should
you.
say, is there anything any resources that come to mind for you or anything actually before we wrap up?
Nothing that comes to
No,
mind, but if it does, I can always just message you or
add it in
make
the,
a
yeah,
comment. Yeah.
lovely. All right. So yeah, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed that
Thank
conversation.
you.
Yeah, absolutely lovely. And yeah, and I hope it really resonated for you and got you thinking in the audience as well. So yeah, please do reach out and ask and get in touch if it did. And also, you know, it is your support that makes this possible. So if it did resonate for you in any ways, please do share it with someone else who you think might find it useful, or write a review or rate it as well, because they all help other people find this stuff and help broaden that conversation out. You can find upcoming episodes, though at point of recording, I don't think I've got any in the calendar, though there are some coming, on YouTube and LinkedIn. And you can also find all the past episodes there as well. And the podcast is available if you search for Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform, though you'll find that we're a few episodes behind still, but slowly catching up with that one. You can go to matthewbellringer.com/links for stuff about all of my stuff and to find more about the show and all of the other stuff that I'm up to. So the next episode, I'm going to be talking to Peter Middleton, who's a podcast producer, audio engineer, and life coach. We're going to be talking about the assumption that you should stay positive. And I feel like there's a kind of a link here, you know, the chaos is a bad thing, negativity is a bad thing, all of that, you know, is like, and there's so much pressure to just express positivity and to be seen as doing well, feeling good, like all of these things. And also a kind of sense that I think if stuff goes badly, it's because you weren't positive enough. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's terribly healthy. So I'm really looking forward to exploring this one further. And that's going to be at 7:30 p.m. UK time on Monday, the 5th of June. So slightly different time to the ones that we normally run, a bit later in the evening. So we'll see how it goes. Bit of an experiment. And I very much hope to see you all then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.